So this video is part of a mini series where I look at the pros and cons of getting these kind of convergence devices that set out to replace the role of two existing products that do their own roles quite well. But when you're confronted with a convergence product, you sort of think, okay, maybe that can replace these two products. And I don't think it's always a good thing. There are pros and cons, and this series is going to look at that. So a really good example of this is comparing the idea of getting an older cheap phone in conjunction with a really good camera, like a mirrorless camera, which is what I'm using here, comparing that with getting, say, the latest iPhone, which sets out to combine the roles of your camera and your phone. And of course, charges a lot for the convenience and sort of tricks you into getting into this annual upgrade cycle because the camera seems to get better every year, and of course that sort of suggests that it's never quite good enough either. So this is a good example of this philosophy, and I think there is a case to be made for rejecting the idea of buying the latest iPhone and instead focusing on a separate, dedicated, really good camera, and that lets you kind of get an older, cheaper iPhone because you're no longer pursuing that latest camera in the new iPhones. So I just want to clarify here that I'm not saying Apple aren't doing something really amazing with the iPhones. What they're doing with the cameras in these latest iPhones is amazing. They are fantastic cameras for a smartphone. But generally what they're doing with the small sensor is kind of faking it. They're faking the look of a camera with a bigger sensor. So the argument I'm making is, why not avoid the fakery and just get a camera with a bigger sensor? So one of the ways they fake this large sensor kind of look to your images is with the shallow depth of field. So we see this in video now with the cinematic mode and of course portrait mode for the still. So they're faking a shallow depth of field by making the background look blurry. And it looks okay, for a quick snap, and if you don't look at it too big. But of course if you zoom in, you look around the edges of where the blur meets the in focus areas, it looks pretty awful, especially if you're comparing it side by side with a proper camera that has a natural shallow depth of field, and you can see the subtlety there. So if you're pursuing that image quality, especially if you're not looking at a really small picture, then the big sensor camera will just really win hands down over what the iPhone can do. So the other physical limitation of a small sensor is its ability to capture information in low light. The result is noise, basically. So the way they deal with noise on the small sensor, again, it comes down to fakery. They're using software to eliminate the noise, or try and eliminate the noise, but at the end of the day, the noise on that sensor reduces the detail it can resolve. So a bigger sensor lets you have much nicer image quality at low light with faster shutter speed, and of course that means less motion blur from your subjects. Obviously the Apple night mode system does all kinds of clever stuff where it will combine pictures together, but essentially it is trying to keep that shutter open for as long as possible. It tells you to hold the camera steady while you do that so it can gather as much information. So again, it's using clever software to try and achieve what a bigger sensor can do naturally, and that's brilliant. It's great that they're doing that because obviously the phones have tiny sensors, so they're trying to overcome those hurdles, and to have something that fits in your pocket and does all that, that's fantastic. But if you do want that real image quality without faking it, you've got to have the big sensor. So I think a nice way of actually showing the impact of this is to scale the iPhone image down. And what you'll notice is, as you shrink it, you see that you're not actually getting rid of any detail. And there's a point at which you start to get rid of detail, so that's the point you stop shrinking it. And then you can see that's the equivalent kind of megapixels that you're actually getting out of your iPhone. And it's a lot less in low light than that official figure that you see on the Apple marketing. So again, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. What they're doing here is amazing, and I'm not saying it isn't. And for many people, it's going to be enough. It would be enough just to obviously enjoy having the smartphone with that amazing camera that it has. So there are, of course, many times when I have just got my phone and I'm really glad to have the camera that it's got on it. So that's still an important thing to keep in mind here. So I think the thing that really annoys me is the way they keep trying to say that the image quality of these devices is enough to make big cameras obsolete. And they're sort of pushing that idea even towards professional filmmakers. They have these ideas that they get Hollywood filmmakers and they're all using their iPhones to make these films. Like, they're not going to use iPhones to make Hollywood films. You'll of course get someone does it for attention, but they're not going to be as good as a proper camera with natural optical shallow depth of field and amazing low light performance because of the bigger sensor. And of course you can go a lot further than a small mirrorless camera. I'm interested in exploring what you can do without spending a huge amount, in particular without spending more than the iPhone itself. So the thing that kind of made me think I'm going to make this video was when I saw them talking about cinematic mode, and they had some quote, and they were saying that the fact that you could change the depth of field after you filmed the shot, and they said some phrase like, even the big Hollywood cameras can't do that. So it's kind of like gaslighting, I think is the phrase. They're diverting the argument to make it sound like it's an impossible argument. It's like, well, it can't have inferior image quality if it's somehow better than a Hollywood film camera in that respect. And you kind of left feeling a bit confused, like, oh, why would I want a big camera then? It's that sort of very sneaky kind of language that they use that I have a particular problem with. I wouldn't mind at all if they were just boasting about their amazing thing that they come up with every year, because that is amazing, what they do in the technology. I don't mind them marketing that, but when they use kind of sneaky language like that to try and convince you that actually the whole thing is better than the proper thing that it's trying to replace, that's the thing I have issue with. So I'm just going to show you the difference in shallow depth of field from a mirrorless camera, which is not an expensive camera by any means, especially not compared to like an iPhone Pro, compared with what the iPhone Pro can do when it's trying to simulate that shallow depth of field. So you can see, you don't have to zoom in very much to see the glaring difference, and in some situations you can see it even just at full size without zooming in at all. So once you forget about the requirement for a phone to be a good camera, and you're quite happy with it just being, sort of the last year or the last couple of years camera because you've got your proper camera that you use, it actually changes the economics of the whole thing. You're no longer thinking you're going to replace the iPhone every year. Instead, you can think, well, I'm going to keep the iPhone for a lot longer, keep it for a longer life cycle, and that changes the cost, the true cost, total cost of ownership drastically. And that's what then allows you to think about spending the money that you're saving from the relentless iPhone upgrade cycle on the mirrorless camera, which again has a much longer life cycle than the phone. So in terms of total cost of ownership, you can get really quite comparable. If you work out what you're actually spending by getting a new iPhone Pro every year, compare that to getting an iPhone that you keep for 4 or 5 years and a mirrorless camera that you keep for 5 or 6 years. The trade-in value of those, if you did want to even upgrade it, you could probably get even longer life cycles out of those if you want to. If you compare those two things, you'll find them very, very close indeed. And that's the interesting point about this whole philosophy, is that the cost is usually comparable and sometimes even cheaper if you kind of reject the convergence devices and you stick with the original kind of counterpart devices. So it's really fun when you find these kind of economic alternative ways of looking at things. You kind of realize that actually there's another option, and maybe one that kind of satisfies a kind of passion a little bit more than just buying what the marketing teams are trying to sell you. They think, okay, we've got people who are interested in photography, let's sell them the latest iPhone Pro because they're interested in photography, and you kind of do that, and then you haven't got any money left, and you think, oh, maybe it would be nice to get a proper camera. Well, this way of thinking about stuff, and you can kind of go down that road. And for me, at least, that decision resulted in me having a lot more fun. I actually have the iPhone 13 mini now, but I'm intending to keep that for a very long time. I made that switch from using older iPhones because of that big form factor switch. The OLED screen in a small phone was a really big deal for me, but that was the only real reason I wanted that. It wasn't because of the camera, although I'm quite happy with the camera on it, but it's not going to be enough for me to change just if they make the camera better on the next one. I'm going to keep it for a long time. It's the form factor that I was really after there. So yeah, it's fun exploring these options. There's all kinds of different areas, and I'm going to look at some of those in different videos too. So if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget the like button. Do have a look around the rest of the channel. There's hopefully something for everyone, and hopefully you'll agree it's worth subscribing. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.